It needs to be balanced with the down part of the wave. The up part of the wave is the sympathetic, but the down part of the wave, the parasympathetic, then you've got a really resilient kid.
Hi, I'm Claire Rowe, and welcome to On the Couch with Claire, the podcast where we're having real conversations about topics that you care about. We're intersecting psychology with everyday life, backed up by science and common sense always. Now, let me tell you, if you're a parent or a grandparent or an aunt, uncle, teacher, if you've got kids in your life, you're going to love today's podcast. Let me start by asking you these questions. Are you a parent who has a child who is highly strung, demanding, fussy, on edge, dysregulated, sensitive, we call them? Let me also ask you, is family life trying to squeeze in on the weekends? The 3 birthday parties, the ballet recital, the family barbecue, and we forgot little Jimmy's soccer presentation. If you feel deep down in your gut like something is just a little bit off kilter with the hamster wheel of family life that we're running on these days, and you're worried about its impact on your children's development and their mental health, you're going to love today's guest. I'm so thrilled to be able to talk again today to Kim John Payne. Kim is originally an Aussie. He's now lived in the States for 25 years with his wife and 2 daughters. He's a family therapist, a counsellor, a speaker, an educator, and is the author of the best-selling book, Simplicity Parenting. His work and his book have influenced my career and how I also work clinically with the families that I see in my therapy practice in Sydney. Kim's theory about why our kids' nervous system is so on edge these days is about the overstimulation that modern family life provides. His theories and his work around this space are so interesting. And when you hear him speak, you can't help but think about all the stuff that we're doing to our kids these days and how we just need to get back to basics. But don't worry, his solutions also are super practical. He has answers that you can go and implement today to help your kids. So I'm so thrilled Kim has agreed to come on the podcast. I can't wait to get into the conversation with him. Let's go. Well, welcome Kim John Payne to the podcast. It is fantastic to have you again. It's been a couple of years now since we've spoken, and I've been itching to talk to you again. So welcome. Thank you very much for your time.
Yeah, nice to see you, Claire. Very nice to see you again. Like you, I've been looking forward to chatting with you.
Great. I want to get straight into it about your work. It's been several years now and since you put out your best-selling book, Simplicity Parenting. And I want to get to the heart of that for people that have not heard of you or heard of this book. If you haven't, you need to go out and get this book if you're a parent, if you're a grandparent, if you work with children at all. But I want to get to why you think ultimately we should be removing things from kids' lives. I love your book because I think it is quietly confronting. And I think it's not confronting in a sense that it's putting out any radical foreign ideas of how to raise children, but it's confronting because I think it really taps in at some gut instinct or knowledge that we as parents have that what you're saying is absolutely correct. But then it's the battle of how do we implement that? And many of us are losing, I think, that battle. So, and I don't think this is just children when we're talking about too much, right? We meet mums, dads at passing ships, at drop-offs to events and pickups from school. And if I ask people, hi, how are you? The response is always, oh, I'm great, but I'm busy, I'm exhausted, and I'm wondering how to fit in the 3 birthday parties and the dance recital and the extra tutoring this weekend. And I'm worried about my 10-year-old on Instagram. And I'm worried about my other son who's got climate anxiety and seeing a psychologist. So it's not just kids, it's adults too. For those that don't know your work, can you explain what simplicity parenting stands for
and why you think we should be removing things from kids' lives, when I think a lot of parents are very well intentioned of what they're trying to do. They're trying to actually enrich development by the violin lesson and the extracurricular things and talking to children and involving them. And I think their intentions are good. So why do you think we should go the opposite way and reduce things from kids' lives?
Yeah, like a really good friend of mine who is an evolutionary neurologist. Interesting job, right? Anyway, I said to her a while back, look, our kids' brains will get used to this, won't they? Won't we adapt? And she said, yeah, it's really interesting. With my doctoral students, I've been working on that for a couple of years now. And she said, we've come up with some really interesting data. And I said, really? Okay, great. What is it? And she said, well, there's good news and bad news. And I said, oh, okay, give me the good news. And she said, yeah, kids' brains might be able to cope with the amount of stimulation that's coming at them these days. And I said, oh, good. Okay. And she said, do you want the bad news? And I said, well, no, not really. Like, maybe not. And she said, well, look, the bad news is if we capped off the pace of life, the amount of stimulation, the amount of stress kids are under today, which very few of us ever had to cope with when we were kids. She said, if we capped it off today, so it didn't, it's rapidly rising, but if we just could magically stop it, kids' brains would be ready to cope with it in about 900 years.
Whoa.
I
Okay.
know, right? So
Wow.
we've gotten 900 years ahead of our nervous system's ability to actually cope with the amount of sympathetic nervous system. Like, the whole sympathetic nervous system is I'm ready, I'm reactive, I'm reacting to stimulation. It's a little bit like a hand ready to catch a ball. Like I'm ready, I'm ready, I'm ready to catch the ball. That's the sympathetic nervous system, right? I'm ready to catch. And then the ball is thrown and got it. Oh, phew. That's the parasympathetic. All right. Now, when those two things are in balance, you got a really resilient kid. You got a kid who can roll with it. Still going to be issues to sort out, but they're malleable. They're not falling into anxiety. When you've got too much, too soon, too sexy, too young, just too much coming into a kid's being, what happens is the sympathetic nervous system goes above the red line. It goes to a point where the amygdala, like the fight, flight, freeze, flock, flood, I had a few other Fs, flood, one little bad thing happens and everything's bad.
Oh
Well,
my goodness, I'm seeing that. I'm seeing that straw that breaks the camel's back with children. And you think,
yeah,
oh my goodness, children are not resilient these days. This little thing has upset them. But it's not just that little thing, right? It's everything before it.
it's kids being above the red line. And what simplicity parenting is about, and it's really interesting, Claire, because I don't know, like 15, 20 years ago or longer, when I first got really interested in this, it was a bit counterculture, really. But now I think that instinct that you talked about as parents, we know something is off about what our kids are being exposed to. We know it's off about the amount of stimulation. And nowadays, that's not so counterculture at all. We're seeing it everywhere, conversations that pick up at school, like you were saying. It's a real topic of conversation. And it's got a little bit to do with, I think we know we need to give more parasympathetic. We need to give more calming. It's not about taking our kids out and living somewhere way out in the outback or something. Recently, recently before COVID, I was in Mongolia. So, and they were going through the same stuff there. So if we think moving to Mongolia is going to help, it doesn't. It's just everywhere. It's everywhere. This pace of life, this unrelenting, booming, buzzing pace of life. And it's not that we have to divorce ourselves from that. Parts, being stimulating kids and having fun and doing stuff and going to parties, and it's all good, but it needs to be balanced with the down part of the wave. The up part of the wave is the sympathetic, but the down part of the wave, the parasympathetic, then you got a really resilient kid. Whereas if we keep living life like we are, what happens, and this is, I know we talked about this once before, I worked with kids in group homes down in Victoria for a good long while, and I saw nervous and jumpy and hypervigilant kids. But at the same time, I was studying with a guy who, it was actually before PTSD became a term that was actually coined. He called it trauma response. It was going ways back. This was a medical doctor and then he trained as a psychiatrist in the Second World War, then the Korean conflict, and then the Vietnam War. And he was talking to us about combat veterans, as I said, nervous and jumpy and startling, over controlling, hyper vigilant was a big one. As he was talking about that, I was thinking, gosh, that describes the kids in my group home. Only he's talking about combat veterans. I'm thinking about the teenagers that I just cared for so much. So he encouraged me to look into this a bit more, and I went and worked in various really troubled areas in Jakarta, Indonesia, up into Thai Cambodian refugee camps, just volunteering, just as a young guy doing what I could. And I saw it again, nervous, jumpy, hyper-vigilant kids, over-controlling, a lot of night terrors, a lot of nightmares, and just really suffering. But you could kind of get your head around it because they'd come from a war zone. So, okay, I decided to study this a bit more, and it was really in the early days of this, but I went to the UK and did some more study and grad work into this. And I had a little counseling practice and just to one side. And through the door came kids who looked like the kids in my group home. They looked like kids in Cambodia, in Jakarta, Indonesia. They just looked like wartime kids, only they were coming from mixed racial, mixed ethnic, mixed economic backgrounds, and there was no reason they should look like that. So I started digging into it, and this is where first of all, I didn't want to recognize that. I wanted a break from trauma. I'd been like for years and I thought, no, I'm not going to notice this. I just don't want to deal with this. This can't be right. But sure enough, as I dug into it more, it was, and they looked just like these kids. And when I did a lot of careful listening to the parents and what was going on, these kids, the reason they looked like wartime kids is that there was the under the radar, unrelenting stimulation and stress that was going on. It wasn't those big life-threatening events, but at the time, brain imaging equipment was becoming available for research. And sure enough, these kids were under what you could call amygdala hijack. They were in full-blown fight or flight because of cumulative stress. Only the problem with this, Claire, is that it's the new normal. We had, even back then, normalized it. But these kids were living in the undeclared war on childhood. And that is what got me interested. And I thought, well, being an Aussie, I just thought, there's got to be a basic answer to this. I'm not going to get like overly fancy. What about if stress can be cumulative and build up to being very, very intrusive in a little kid's life or a teenager's life, what about if we cumulatively took it away? That's a basic thought. I didn't have too many post-grad degrees at that stage. I could just have a simple thought. And so we did. We did this. We just took whatever we could do. We unstressed these kids' lives, gave them more downtime, decompression time, let them be bored, let them find creative stuff to do. We pulled back on the scheduling because parenting has become like an arms race. And so we pulled back on the scheduling. And you know what? I can't tell you how many kids went from diagnoses like ADD, OCD, ODD, opposition defiance disorder. There were all these diagnoses, and they just slid back along a spectrum, if you like, to being just quirky. But the really interesting thing is as these kids' lives kept being balanced and their nervous systems regulated, and they came back down below the red line, then it wasn't just they were quirky again, that was their gift. Like the child who was really hypervigilant, nervous and anxious and wouldn't sit in a room, would scan a room, really anxious. The quirk of that child is just that they noticed stuff, but their gift was that of amazing empathy and sensitivity. That's just one example of many, many, many. And it was every time it's happened, and it's happened a lot since over these last 30 years, it never fails to move me. So that's a bit of a background into the whole what drives me in my work to keep life balanced for kids. Yeah.
Yeah, it's actually incredible when you think of it. And so if I've got this right, these kids, and this is what's hooked me in at the start of your book, that comparison between children from a war-torn country that anyone would say, of course, understandable post-traumatic stress disorder, clingy, dysregulated, jumpy. But now we're looking at children seemingly middle class, everything going for them, children in the UK, very much mirrored here in Australia, in the middle of Sydney where I practice. And these children to me are presenting in the same way. Now, you talk about too much and too much stimulation, and I want to get in a little bit into details about what that looks like, what stimulation, because I think we are the frog boiling in water that most parents aren't even aware of the aspects of their children's lives that actually create too much. So I want to get into those details, but I always have said in my career, and certainly of recent years, very much influenced by your work, that why do we need to be careful of this? Not just in the fact that we're creating anxious, essentially, sometimes depressed, sometimes poorly behaved, acting out kids, but talk to me a little bit about if children's minds are not given the chance to fulfill some very important processes in childhood. And that's where I come from, is that I think as adults, we lead busy lives in careers or jobs, and we've kind of got this higher order thinking going on. And we think childhood is about play and go to school and have fun and do your painting. And it's just not true that they have so much more to accomplish in a day that we're not seeing, because we're not seeing it as a task sitting down at a table. But when they're outside playing or they're doing seemingly innocuous fun things to us, there is a world of activity going on in that brain, essential that they do in the first 5-10 years of life. So is that correct, Kim? Would you say that if we're going to expose children, let's just say too much too early, get them to grow up quicker, we can go into that social media, adult concepts they're exposed to. If we're going to fill their brain even partially with some of that stuff, what is the risk that the brain won't be able to actually do what it's supposed to do in the first decade of life?
Yeah, like you, I've had a long interest in brain development and brain science for kids and tweens and teens. And a lot of it's got to do with myelination, right? A lot of it's got to do with laying down of pathways in the brain. And one of the things that is really startling is, for the first time in human evolution, our reptilian brain, the amygdala in kids, is actually growing. It's been shrinking for our entire evolution.
Just explain to people, what is the function of the amygdala? We know it's a part of the brain that develops first. You call it the reptile brain. Just for parents listening, what is the function of the amygdala?
Well, the amygdala is a really important part of our brain stem, of the lower brain, and it's got to do with just scanning for safety. It's got to do with survival. It's got to do with instinct over intellect. And a good example of what's happening with the amygdala and the brain base in general, that primitive brain, that first wrap. If you think about the 3 wraps of the brain, you've got that sort of primitive brain, which is all about volition, doing, safety, go. Then you've got the second wrap of the brain, which many things, but that's the creative, empathetic part of the brain. And then you've got the third wrap of the brain, the frontal lobes, which is all about the cognitive thinking, executive functioning, right? And you want all 3 parts of those brain to be myelinated, to be working, to be in harmony. What happens when kids are overwhelmed is that the amygdala gets fired. And because they're trying to synthesize a lot of information, a lot's coming at them, and children's brains can't assimilate that amount of information. It's a little bit like the metaphor I use often is this: there's this guy in a little guard box and there's a big boom gate, and the boom gate is down and some traffic comes up to the brain base, and the guy comes out with a flashlight. The person then says, okay, you're really interesting. You go there. And then the up, down it goes. And then he comes, oh, you're really funny. You are so funny. You go there. And then it comes down again. And they come down. Oh, you're really creative. That's beautiful. Up there, you go. And then the last, and then flashlight. You are a really scary looking dude. I know right where you go. You go to the amygdala. There, go. Okay. Now that's a healthy kid that can do that, differentiate. But if you've got traffic coming up to that boom gate, and it's snarled and it's like peak hour in Sydney, and the traffic's going all over the place and the honking of horns, and the guy in the little guard box says, I'm out of here. I'm done. I cannot cope with this amount of stimulation. I can't slow it down and can't direct it. So I am going to bring big barriers, and I'm going to place them across academic learning. I'm going to place them across empathy. I'm going to put big barriers across creativity, humor. All these things are going to be barricaded up because I can't cope with this. I'm going to leave one road open because there might be 1 out of 100 things that are scary. So this traffic, almost all of it's going to go to the scary brain, to the amygdala, because there might be a terrorist there. So all the traffic's going to go there. So the amygdala gets all this stimulation, and the learning centers, the empathy centers, the humor centers, the creative centers of the brain, the balance centers. More and more kids are needing occupational therapy now because their balance is out of whack, or they can't sleep. A lot of eating issues come out. All that stuff starts to get closed down. And those roadways start breaking up. They start degrading. And that's...
So, yeah, I mean, if I can put it this way for people, I mean, at the end of the day, our brain needs to keep us alive, right? So it just goes into what is the priority here? And the priority is to stay alive and stay safe. And I need to shut off now, as you said, higher order, creativity, learning. There's no point in learning to do a beautiful artwork if I am in that fear response, that I am literally faced with threat. So yes, if we're flooded, then I better err on the side of caution, I suppose, shut everything else off and make sure that at least we'll catch the threat if there is one in those 100 people queuing up to get into the car park.
And to put it conversely, one of the things that our coaches and group leaders, and because we've trained over 1,500 coaches around the world, many in Sydney, actually, and we get a lot of feedback from a lot of different cultures. And one of the pieces of feedback that I've seen come in so many times, and I see it as a reliable pattern, is that when we dial back their lives, when we have less activity, less stimulation, we give them more downtime, we give them more creative playtime, we just dial it back, what happens is their academics really improve. And parents often say, wow, that's amazing. And I say, well, it is, and it's beautiful, and it's wonderful, but it's not amazing because now the frontal lobes, the learning centers, the empathy centers of the brain those barriers can be removed, and now traffic can start flowing. And there are kids, in one study we did into ADHD, where we had bunches of kids who simplified in various ways. We had various cohorts. The kids who had a very simplified balanced regime and also went low or no screen was really interesting. That was the group that improved the most. They jumped 1.5 grade levels in 6 months. And this was a really fairly rigorous academic testing. And their academics just jumped. Their reading jumped. These were 12-year-olds. And this is the irony of it a little bit, Claire, is that parents who want their kids to do really well, get them into grammar schools and do really, really well, and are putting tons and tons and tons of extracurricular activities their way, they're actually achieving the opposite. If you give kids a balanced life, yeah, of course they can be in the soccer team or they can learn piano. But if you give them a balanced life, then their academic work is going to be more joyful. They're going to have this love of learning as opposed to attack it like it or revile or push back from it because of that survival thing that you just mentioned. And so the irony of pushing kids really, really hard so that they can get on, it reminds me a little bit of my grandpa fought in the First and the Second World War, right? And he was of that generation that caught both of these just terrible global conflicts. And then we call his generation, the diggers and his generation that fought in these wars and that rebuilt Australia after the economic crash, the global crash, the wars. We call them the greatest generation, right? And we still think of them as the greatest. But these people from the greatest generation, they had nothing. They had nothing. And they built this country and they built their lives out of nothing. Now, why do we think giving kids everything is going to make them great? It's actually, it makes them emotionally weak and not prepared for the world that's coming our way. The figures are that in 2022, just after, well, that was the projection. I think COVID might have skewed it, but certainly now, 2024, over half of all employment is now project-based, part-time, and it's gig economy, it's putting things together, it's self-employment. Now, if our kids are going into the world of self-employment, and if you've got a kid at 10 years old, that's going to be rising into the 60, 70 percentile. It's a pretty strong likelihood that they're going to have to put it together for themselves. So why do we think us putting it together for them is going to help them be successful? Coming back to your original point is that kids who are successful in future life, like we all know, if anyone is self-employed, they know this. If you're self-employed, the things you need to be successful are pretty clear, right? Because Claire, you've been self-employed or freelance for a while, right? You know what self-employment's like.
I have my whole career. I've never had a job, Kim. I tell people, never had a job, always.
Yeah, well, if I could ask you, if I may, if you had to pick half a dozen words that describe success in self-employment, freelance work, what would they be?
Well, I have a very clear purpose, goals, trajectory, somewhere I want to reach. I don't have someone to get me out of bed each day to make sure I clock on time. I don't have someone looking over me. I like that. I like the autonomy would be a word, the flexibility, but at the same time, I've got to be very driven to know where I'm going and where I want to get to and how to figure it out, how to get to point B, because I don't have an instruction manual necessarily. So I like the challenge of figuring it out and going down one path and that doesn't work. So I go down a different path, and the fulfillment that it brings me when I get to point B and I say, I did it. Now, where's my next point B?
Okay. So this could apply to many things, but Claire, as you were giving those examples, every single one of those applied to a 9-year-old building a fort.
Yes.
Every single one of those qualities. That's where we myelinate that part of the brain, when we give kids the chance to muck around and we allow time for them to creatively play. Sometimes people say to me, Kim, it's all very well and good, this simplicity parenting stuff, back to the little house on the prairie and, just it's all good. That's all in the past. And my point is that's exactly not accurate. Giving kids downtime, giving them time to learn. If I had to paraphrase those words, Claire, it'd be stuff like grit, determination, getting yourself out of bed, self-motivation, people skills, right? Because you write me these lovely letters inviting me to come talk to you. I can't resist. You've got a lot of people skills, if I may say. So there's people skills, there's cooperation, all these things cultivated through play. Are they cultivated a little bit in the soccer team and the football team? Yeah, a little bit. But my goodness, they're cultivated a lot when kids get together and they argue and they work things out, and then it doesn't go right, and then whatever it is they're building or doing together. And I watch children do that. And I know it's a little bit of a weird thought, but I watch them and I can almost literally see their empathy and learning centers of their brain just sopping it up, just growing. Now, when we give kids time and space and grace for childhood, and it's not radical giving children a childhood, then we are setting them up for future success. We're not disadvantaging them. We're just simply not. We're actually laying down the pathways for them, for the world that is coming in their direction.
And I think that that's a really good point when you said, that we're not disadvantaging them. And that's what parents need to hear, because the experience, like I started with, of the school pickup, and when you say to parents, oh, we're trying to fit all this in, and the response usually is, oh, yeah, so are we. That's life, that's parenting. And I've said for many years now, no, that's not parenting. That's not family life. That's not actually how it's been for multiple generations. And it doesn't have to be that way, that we all just give each other permission to say, oh, well, kids these days, or, oh, come and have a look at my son's bedroom. It's even worse than yours. So there's actually a bit of, we're all trying to just avoid that uncomfortableness actually of saying the truth, which is, no, this is not right. And we, as I said, we know it in our guts, but somehow we fumble along, particularly when we've got peers of our children who have signed up for the extra dance class, or we're doing some extra training, or we're doing this. And you do think, oh, is my child now disadvantaged? So I think that that's an excellent point, that you're not disadvantaging. You're in fact doing quite the opposite based on what you're saying about academic results. And when you were talking about improved academic results, my mind just went to, above and beyond the grade on the academic work. Imagine the confidence and the self-esteem and the love of learning that is the repercussion of that. I mean, that's lifelong. And I love your book, because if we get down now to some of the details, I mean, if we get our head around that concept and we accept that this is what's happening with our children, and we think, okay, well, how do I start looking at my family and my life? Your book is lovely because it very clearly articulates into certain areas that we can look at. And one is the physical environment, that is literally the stuff. And I use that word intentionally because it's stuff, that's all it is, that fill our children's bedrooms. There's some wonderful descriptions in your book that I steal/paraphrase, Kim, with my clients, and to talk about, I bet I could describe your child's room. I walk in there, the drawers can't close, everything's falling out, you can't see much of the floor, there are broken toys. And so that is one aspect of overwhelm. And then you go through other areas, overscheduling we've mentioned. And one of the areas that you talk about that I'm particularly interested in is the exposure of information to children. Now, this is just going to be exponentially a problem with children accessing the internet. But if we come down to back to the home and parents and start there, I think there has been certainly an increase in children being exposed, or parents feeling that they are educating children by having discussions with them about adult concepts. Now, whether that be social concepts, environmental concepts, politics. And I just recall a very common response of my mother to questions from me as a child of, what's this about? Would be, I'll tell you when you're older. Oh, that was a very dead end kind of response. You didn't really go much further than that. It was like, oh, okay. And I think with the move to child-centered parenting, there's a misconstruing there of what is child-centered, to invite them in to conversations that, first of all, their brain can't understand from a cognitive point of view. But coming back to that concept of pulling the brain off course, if they're going to start worrying about geopolitics, Middle East conflict, climate change, whatever the issue is, it's not about the issue. But if they're going to start pulling away brain energy into those areas, what are they not using that brain energy to accomplish? And I think you put it really lovely in the book, and I've always remembered this, when you say something like, it doesn't encourage or mobilize children to go and solve these big problems when they are aware of them. It actually paralyzes them with fear or anxiety. And it actually stops them from developing the skills in childhood that may produce an adult that solves these big problems. That's the irony, I think. So taking that chapter from your book about information that was written a little while ago now and bringing it into 2024, do you think it's appropriate that children are involved in some of these conversations, and how do parents know what's appropriate or shield children from this?
Probably the best answer to that, Claire, is just a little story, if I may. It's a brief little story, and it's about my own kids. And my kids, who are older now, 22, 24 years old, say, I'm only allowed to tell 3 stories about them per day. So I'm using one up here. So I live in a town that is pretty middle class, college, universities around, but fortunately, we also have low income housing, and a lot of it. And it's in a pretty beautiful place. So a lot of people are drawn, and there's a lot of unhoused people, semi-housed or unhoused. So my wife and I would walk down the street, and probably about every 20, 30 yards, there was someone asking for money. And I got these 2 little gorgeous girls and holding their hands, and they really are gorgeous. It's great, Claire. They grew up to look like their mother, thank goodness. And anyway, and so we're walking down the street, and they're being asked for money all the time, money. And we get home and they say, Daddy, can we get money to give those people? And I explained to them a little bit about, well, what do you think we could do for those people? And they said, I think it's not just money that they need. People give them money, but they still are there. We think they need friends. And I said, do your girls? And they said, yes. So they made them a bunch of, these friendship bracelets, like braided, and they were busy little bees for weeks. And they made a big bag of friendship bracelets, and they went down the street giving one after another, getting hugs and kisses from these people and big thank yous. And they made them these friendship bracelets. And then a couple of them asked, how do you make them? And they also gave them some little ideas. And then another person asked, and another. So then they came home and said, do you know what we're going to do? And I said, what, girls? And they said, we're going to make up little bags, little baggies of all the stuff you need to make friendship bracelets. And then we're going to show them how to do it. So
oh, my goodness.
We went down the street, and it was amazing. It's such a funny scene. There was they were blocking the pathway, and people were walking around because there was a circle of about 20 unhoused people sitting around these 2 little girls aged 7 and 9-ish, 10-ish at the time. And they're all making these friendship bracelets. And so another couple of weeks go by, and we walk down the street, and there's several of these unhoused people selling friendship bracelets and people buying them. And they're just sitting there through the day. No longer are they just sitting there staring into space. They're not just sitting. Now they're busy. A couple of more weeks go by, they've formed a cooperative. I mean, honestly, this is a
oh my goodness.
And now they've got someone else in who saw them doing this, who's helping them make jewelry. So now and so on, and so it goes. Now, these little girls, I could have told them all about, gone into the whole spiel about the world and about what happened to these people, about trauma and about post-traumatic stress disorder, because that's my field. I could have talked to them about that. And therapists often have the weirdest kids, because we just talk too much, about all this stuff. Some therapists don't. Well, they really don't. But anyway, these 2 little girls, they grow up, and one of them has become a bit of an eco-warrior now. as a young adult. The other one is trained in early childhood special education because she wants to help little kids who are really struggling feel that school and kindergarten is a place that's welcoming for them. And so they go on protests recently, but not when they were 7 years old, not even when they were 10 years old. As they grew up, I mean, one of them got involved in the Heifer Foundation as a teenager, where you raise funds literally for a cow or a goat for some. And she motivated her whole class, was part of the motivation, raising money, really doing a lot of work for Amnesty was one, and the Heifer Foundation. You see, it's a little bit like the marathon image, the marathon running image. It's a slow start, but a really strong finish.
I love that.
And,
Yeah.
and that's what we hope for, right? That's that. So there's my one story used up.
What a ripple effect that your daughter's had in that community. But the point is, as you said, it's not an inability or a shying away from teaching children what is the underlying skill of empathy, of understanding, of reaching out to people. It's about doing it in that age appropriate way. I love that marathon analogy, actually, that it just comes down to the too much too soon. It doesn't have to be a 5-year-old at the protest yelling into the megaphone, as in 2024, sadly, we are seeing in Australia. That's not to say that they won't accomplish those things. They've got more chance of accomplishing that social change if that's what they want to pursue as an adult. But the exposure to it, I worry, again, coming back neurologically as a child, I just don't think that the argument that I'm faced with parents of raising socially conscious global citizens, there is time. And that is usually my response to many things, that there is time. And it doesn't have to be that we force this on a 7-year-old and therefore they'll be even more socially conscious in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years' time. It doesn't work like that. In fact, we run the risk of the opposite. And then it comes back, I suppose, to those overarching principles of your work and others, and as many analogies for it about parents being the quiet in the storm or being the safe harbor, where there is a quietening and a calmness and the dial is turned down on the outside
Yeah.
world. I
Yeah,
love that.
If you think about two things here, Claire, if you think about changing the world, we want to have kids change the world. I change those worlds to change their world. Their world. If there's a child at school who forgets to bring their lunch or is from very low income environment and needs just quietly some help in some way with some clothing or what, and not charity, but just the things kids do for each other. Or if there's a kid who's not being included in the game, in the foursquare game or the kickball game, changing their world is inviting them to play. In middle school or high school, changing their world is seeing someone that has no one to sit with in the playground out in the recess yard. So they go and sit with them, even though they're not popular. That's changing their world, not the world. And their world will expand as they grow. So, yes, do we want children to change their world? Yes. Do we want them to change our world, the world? No, because that's just our world. It's not theirs. Let them change their world and don't basically adultify them. And the image that you mentioned about the harbor is a really interesting one, because some parents have said to me, but Kim, you're keeping kids in a bubble, mate. Like, really, there's the real world there. And my point to that is this harbor image that you mentioned is that, our families, they're at their best if we can just do whatever we can do with all the good, the bad, and the in-between to make our home life a little cove, a little harbor that they can sail back into after school, after kindergarten, after high school, even college, university, and work, even marriage and their own kids. But they can sail back into that harbor and they can rest, they can repair, they can recoup, and then ready to go out into the world again. It's not that we're trying to prevent them from going into the world, but when they're little, they just go a little way out with their little boats and chug around, and then they come back in. When they're a bit older, they go a little bit further. And when they're teenagers, they will go out into those stormy seas, guaranteed. And their sails and their masts will be tattered sometimes, metaphorically, and they come back into our families and they've got places to rest and recoup. And so what it's doing is enabling them to be more effective and be more resilient in the world. I'm not suggesting keeping them in a bubble in any way. I'm suggesting that we need to have a place where they can recuperate and make the repairs they need to make. And then out they go again, because they will go out. No one is trying to prevent them from doing that. But if a little kid is going too far out and further and further, and then they're really little and they're getting themselves into all sorts of bother, or a 12-year-old is getting involved with all kinds of stuff out there in the streets, we're going to launch our speedboat, go right on out and bring them back in. Yes, we are, because at 12 they shouldn't be seeing illicit drug dealings and so on and so on, whatever it is. We're going to do that too. But our homes, and that's where simplicity parenting comes into it, because it doesn't say to parents they've got to do anything. It's an unusual parenting movement and book. It doesn't tell you to do anything at all. It just says do less.
Kim, I've just had a thought. Can I just jump in as you were talking
Yeah,
there?
do.
And I'm going to try and articulate this. Initially, when you said, the parents have said, oh, but we're trying to keep them in a bubble. For young children, my initial thought then was, what's wrong with that? That sounds quite lovely. But I think it'd be a little bit of a paradox or at odds here, where some parents will expose children to the world prematurely and expose them to concepts that they can't cope with on a number of levels, emotionally, cognitively. And we want to expose them to that because we want to prepare them. So goes the argument from some. But at the same time, when we come back in their world, we will problem solve and fix for them, to build the Lego set for them, to rush up when they're having a problem at school. So it seems odd that at the same time we're imposing on their world to minimize any adversity problems and we're fixing it for them. At the same time, we want to prepare them by exposing them to adult concepts. And yet we would prepare them for the world out there by not doing that in their world, by not coming into their world and fixing everything. Is that right?
I hadn't thought of it like that, Claire. It's a really good thought, because if we've got a little child, 6, 7 years old, we don't want to be taking them a couple of miles out to sea when a storm's coming, politically, geopolitically, the climate and so on, and just dumping them there and saying, there, cope. We're not. But if we do that, we go too far out, then when they come back in, they're so disturbed and they're so anxious and they're not sleeping and they're hypervigilant, and then they go to school and they become really reactive, and then they get targeted by other kids and bullied because they're reactive, and then we swoop in and try and solve everything for them. If we reverse engineer that, we won't put them out there in the first place, because their reactivity and trouble at school and trouble with friends, that's just a symptom. The cause was too much, too soon, too sexy, too young. And how great is it that the answer is just dialing it back? I mean, many things have complicated answers, and I'm not suggesting there aren't complications to this as well, but dialing stuff back is a really good start.
I could talk to you all day, Kim. I want to just ask you a couple of quick questions. Are there any cultures in the world who do this well, who have maintained this? I love that you said before that this is everywhere. Weirdly, I loved that because sometimes I tell myself as a parent of two young kids, oh, well, it's living in Sydney in a big city. And to get to that point, I'd have to move to the country. So I think that that's an excuse my brain comes up with. So I love that you said, it's the same. Any cultures or, groups that you've observed that do this particularly well, or really is it now pervasive with every child?
It's a good question. It's so interesting because you only have to go back 3 or 4 generations back to our grandparents or great grandparents. And kids they were raised simply for the most part, not all, but I don't mean to overgeneralize, but there was a lot less going on, right? A lot less stimulation. There wasn't TV, there wasn't screens, there wasn't all this sympathetic nervous system activity. All right. Now, but the thing about that was that, Claire, your and my great grandmothers raised our grandmothers like they were raised, and our grandmothers raised our mothers like they were raised. And there was just this thing that you did. Now, it's so great that we're free of that, and it's such a pity that we're free of that.
Yes.
Right? So now,
yes. Oh my goodness, because I say people in previous generations, they didn't go to the Facebook blogs and the mummy blogs and the parenting experts that I hate, that I'm kind of part of that industry. And they didn't go to all this. What did they do? They did what their mother did. They did what their mother did. I mean, if I spoke to my mother, she'd say, oh, we didn't really talk about how to parent. We just did it. Now, the feedback to that is, oh, but we don't want to go back to those days of generational kind of trauma, and we don't want to just repeat bad habits. That's not what I'm saying. No, we don't. So I love that you said that it's a curse and a blessing at the same time.
It's a blessing and a curse. So where are the cultures that are doing this now? They are dissipated around the world. It's now a worldwide culture in many countries. Right there in Sydney, I live really close to New York City. In New York City, this huge, booming city, there is such a culture of parents living simply, right in the center of the city. Right on the North Shore, speaking to people from the North Shore today, right on the North Shore in Sydney, there are people and schools and groups, and they're coming together because it can be a little lonely when you say, you know what, we're just going to do one sport this term. We're not going to do 2. And let's say there's 3 school terms. We're going to do one sport and then have a break for a term. This is talking to a 12-year-old. And then we'll do a second one, if you want to, 3rd term. But we're not doing all 2 sports, all 3 terms, and one of them is traveling all over the place anyway. No, we're not going to do that. We're going to do it this way. And that culture now, I think we're looking for it, but it's in the invisible. It's no longer countries. Not really, a little bit, of course, but in the West and in countries like Australia and where I live now in North America, we're finding communities of consciousness. And that's what you're doing so beautifully there in Sydney, Claire, because because ultimately this is about choice. It's not about how much screens do you expose your kids to, how many sports do you play, what you do. It's not so much that, it's got to do with making a conscious choice, just saying, I don't have to buy into this. I'm going to think about this. I'm going to read about it a little bit, and then I'm going to make a choice. And when my kids grow up a bit more, I'll redecision it because they can cope with it a little more. And when they're teenagers, I'll redecision it. It's not like just one size fits all, but it's choice, and it's communities of choice and finding other people like that.
Okay. So if we leave parents now that are listening to this, who are heavy with I'm going to say the burden of turning that hamster wheel, because they're feeling it and they might be doing this for their children, but at the end of the day, adults are going to benefit as well from this. And they're going to enjoy their children, which shouldn't be a foreign concept. So if parents are listening to this and they say, right, I really want to think about making a change. I don't want this to be something I revisit in 6 months or 12 months and think, oh, I just didn't do it. Can you give them something right now, today, that they can go away and do? Do they start trying to find other communities? Do they read about it a bit more? Do they bring the family around the table and present the idea? What do you think parents can take away practically today if they're listening to this?
So here's a way of judging it. I was talking to a family just today. I still have a family counseling practice, of course. And the dad said to me, how do I judge it? How do I judge when my kid's doing too much or doing too little? How do
Great
I
question.
really, right? Good
Yeah.
question. And I talked to him about what's your kid's character? We just talked about their character, their quirks that make them so lovable and kind of infuriating sometimes, but it's just their quirk, that's who they are. And we talked about that a bit and we defined that. And I said, okay, so that's the quirk. He's a bit of a go-getting type of kid, active, go-getting, had leadership qualities. That was his character. And I said, okay, so when you're about got it right and your kid is in flow, what does that look like when he's really at his best? And the dad said, well, his leadership qualities become real sort of, he initiates stuff that other kids really love. So, okay. And he's just incredibly creative and they build some amazing things. So he's super creative. Okay. And he said, and he can become really patient. He'll bring other kids because he's got younger siblings. He'll bring them along and find a place for them. I said, I love it when he does that. And I said, wow, what parent wouldn't, right? What a gorgeous kid. I said, well, and that's when life is not moving too fast, right? And he said, yeah. I said, so what happens when life moves too fast? And he said, well, I can tell you, because we just did a lot of traveling and hot off the press, here's what happens. His leadership qualities become really bossy. He's really, really bossy. And we've been struggling with him for a couple of weeks now. So, okay, he has to have things his own way. He won't allow his siblings to touch his stuff. So every single one of those qualities that he listed that were beautiful and in flow also had an emotional fevered side to it. So here's my message, is that this is so individual, is watch your kids. And if they're doing okay, and particularly okay, if they're doing so okay, that's fine. But if they're in flow and their gift and their little genius is coming out, life's going okay. But if it starts to become problematic, and even disorderly, try dialing it back. Now, there might be other things going on. I'm not suggesting that, but try dialing it back first. And over the years, thousands and thousands of parents have said, when I dialed it all back, they became their quirky little selves again. And when I kept it simple and kept it balanced, there they were. That was their genius. There was their flow. They were in flow again. So I think if we watch our kids and when they get out of whack, just dial it back. That could be a rap, Claire, when they get out of whack, dial it back. Never thought of that. But it's a t-shirt, something. But that's the way to judge it. That's the way to judge it. Yeah.
So that father really answered his own question, didn't he, by that?
Beautifully.
Those descriptions, he just gave you the answer right there. And I think coming back to what you said, it is a conscious decision. And for me as a parent, understanding this so well as a clinician, I still have moments where the kids are dysregulated or tired or there's something off kilter. And I have to come back to, okay, well, what's changed? Oh, look, we're doing this or we're added this. It's not a set and forget thing. And when you're the frog boiling in the water, living surrounded by others that seemingly live these too much overfilled lifestyles and experiences for kids, it's very hard sometimes not to lose where you are and where you want your and line and boundary to be, but that's okay. You have that harbor or that port to think, oh, hang on a second, we've wandered a bit. And I do that all the time. And I sit down and I think, well, my first step, yes, there might, as you said, there might be other things going on. But my first step is always to say, how can I dial it back a little bit? I'll do that first and we'll see what the effect of that is. So,
You see, Claire, because when you dial back, when we dial the world back, we dial ourselves in. It's not just dialing the world back, it's dialing ourselves in, because when we slow things down out there, we get more connected with our kids. We have board game nights. We start baking with them. We start building forts with them. We start building little BMX courses with them. We start going to the park with them. And I don't mean we have to, that's the singular and only one focus in our lives. I have to say that, although I think it should be. But it's when we dial the world back, we dial ourselves in, and that's what really counts.
The space for us. We're creating the space for us where there wasn't. Yeah. Kim, I love this. I love that you've come back on and had a chat. I need to book you in again. It can't be 3 years again. But I think all of our parents listening will really just eat up this and really take something away from this. And I think you're making a tremendous difference. So I thank you very much for all of your work that you're doing. And thanks for joining me.
Oh, it's so nice to see you again, Claire. Bye-bye for now.
Thank you so much for giving up your valuable time and joining me today on the couch. If today's conversation spoke to you, consider sharing the love and send it to someone you know who needs to hear it. Don't forget you can watch this full episode on my YouTube channel. And if you've enjoyed today's conversation, all I ask is that you hit that subscribe button. It helps us to be able to deliver bigger and better content to you absolutely free of charge. If you've got comments or questions about today's episode, head on over and come hang out on Instagram, where you can follow and contact me. Okay, stay curious, stay connected, and join me next time on the couch. Take care. Okay, for those who've made it this far, just remember, even though I am actually a registered and qualified psychologist, this podcast is for educational and entertainment purposes only and should not be considered professional individual advice.